Hello and welcome to Connect and Collaborate. I am Alex Hopkins, your on-air producer, and I am ready to start drinking. I am here with Whistling Hare owner, Sandy Rothe. So Sandy, interestingly enough, you are relatively new to the distillery business. About 2.5 years ago, you bought the Whistling Hare, yeah?
Yes, although that wasn't my first, I didn't just plop into it.
Oh, okay.
So I'd actually been working on, I'd planned to open my own distillery. And I've been working on this for like 6 years or more.
Oh,
And I went to Scotland to whiskey school and a couple other distilling schools and classes and distillery visits and read about everything I could find on the topic. So I was going to retire. I retired from my day job a year ago, and I was going to start one from scratch. And the Whistling Hare had been open for about a year, almost a year and a half. The previous owner had to move to Indiana. So I bought this because it jump-started my plans right away.
well, yeah.
And so I've been officially in the business about 2.5 years, but there's about 6 years of
Prep work.
prep work to get there. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about this prep work. Did you kind of like just wake up from a dream in the middle of the night, like I need to own a distillery, let's start, or was it more along the lines of you kept recurring and then you finally decided to chase that dream? How
Yeah.
did that work out?
Yeah, everybody asks that. So I went to Napa every year, visited wineries. And as I was approaching retirement in that same time period, you're sitting out in the vineyard and you're sipping wine and it's such a fine experience. I go, hey, this would be fun, right? This would be a great way to retire.
Yeah.
But there was really I wasn't ready to move to Napa or Grand Junction at this point. Good grapes really aren't an option in the greater Denver area. I was a single malt Scotch guy. That was my whiskey of choice. And so I kind of went from winery, thought a little bit about, fruits from the western slope to make fruit brandies or other things, and really just said, okay, I like whiskey. If I'm going to have a drink, I'll have a whiskey. And that's where I evolved to.
Nice.
So I went to Scotland to whiskey school. But since I've been back and since I've bought the Whistling Hare, I've really kind of migrated from a single malt whiskey, which is the Scottish style of whiskey, to bourbon because that's really the American whiskey. And the kind of the setup and the equipment and all that we had was a little more conducive to bourbon. So I've kind of become a bourbon guy.
Interestingly enough, I am a bourbon gal myself.
Okay.
I reign from Kentucky.
Oh, sure.
Yes. So I was under the firm belief that true bourbon only comes from Kentucky.
Everybody from Kentucky believes that, but that's not true. So bourbon is an American drink, so you can't make bourbon anywhere except in the United States.
Okay.
But the legal definition of bourbon is that it's 51% or more corn, aged in new charred oak barrel, and then there's a few other more technical requirements about the proof that you distill it at and the proof that you age it at. But you can make it anywhere. So you can have Colorado bourbon, Kentucky bourbon, Texas bourbon.
Yes, which Texas bourbon, that just sounds like an oxymoron
Yeah,
in my
exactly.
book, but yeah.
I get it.
So you brought up the winery, right?
Right.
And the Napa-Valley look. So I imagine at the moment that wineries and breweries particularly are kind of a saturated market. How are the distilleries moving alongside that? Are they also kind of saturated? You mentioned, we were talking off air, it's a little competitive at the moment,
Right.
but not overly saturated.
So there are not nearly as many craft distilleries as there are craft breweries.
Right.
On a kind of a similar trajectory, they're just kind of like 10 years behind. But the barriers of entry for a distiller versus a brewer, it's harder to be a distiller from just amount of capital to start, the regulatory process. You can't distill at home. You can brew and make wine at home, but you can't distill at home. So
It's called moonshine.
Moonshine, right? Exactly. So I don't see that the distilling industry and the craft side will ever get quite as saturated as the craft brewing side is right now, and there's shakeout right now on both the brewing and the distilling side.
Okay.
So some of these earlier people that have got into the business found it's harder, takes more capital. It's not a automatic home run. No matter how good your product is, very few take off there's stories of like that, but there's not very many that do that. So it is competitive.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the you haven't asked the question, but I'll get ahead of you, maybe.
Okay, go for it.
The Napa experience was really telling. My game plan is to have a more of a destination Napa experience than the traditional craft distilling experience that you currently see.
I love that idea.
So most of the craft distillers are like we are. We're in some kind of industrial type warehouse, reconfigured building. And the reasons for that are a variety of reasons, but to be a craft distiller, especially if you're making whiskey, you've got to have a decent sized production space. You have to have an even larger barrel storage space. You have to have a tasting room. And all that takes space, which is expensive. And oddly, no one ever zoned for a craft distiller. So we've got storage, industrial, production. We're a little bit, not hazardous, but we make a flammable liquid, right?
Yeah.
And so you just can't put one anywhere, any place, any time. Brewers don't have that limitation. Vintners don't have that limitation because beer isn't flammable.
Right, exactly.
So my goal, and I'm actively looking and may have found a location to build really what I wanted from the beginning, which is a more Napa type experience.
Yes.
Some land, outdoor barrel warehouse.
I'm going to go ahead and ask for a VIP tour when that's up and running.
Of course,
Yes.
you can come, absolutely. Right?
Yeah, write my name down.
Maybe a barrel cave instead of a warehouse, but so that's the longer term plan, vision. And you'd asked earlier about how do you compete and what happens if people don't like it. That's part of the experience. Because I want people to come have a great experience. So when you go to Napa, they educate you on the grapes and how you make it, and you enjoy it, but you learn about it, and you learn usually not just about their wine, but about other wines as well. I want to do the same thing. I want people to come learn about the different types of spirits, and we have a broad range. So we have bourbon, vodka, gin, rum.
Yes.
And I want them to learn about those different styles or types of spirits, how they're made, why they're different, and learn to like them and appreciate them.
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned to you off air a little bit, it took me a while to get my palate on board with the bourbon. I still am not an overly big fan in drinking other alcohols, spirits, if you will, straight or neat, like I do with bourbon. But that being said, so the Whistling Hare had been already open for about 1.5 years when you stepped in.
Yes.
Were all of these flavors, the vodka, the gin, bourbon, already available, or is that something you've implemented since your reign started?
The vodka, the rum, and a bourbon was all under production in some form or fashion. We've pretty much kept the vodka and rum as it was. We've tweaked a little bit. We think made it a little bit better maybe, but the bourbon we've changed. So our bourbon now is about 60% blue corn that we source from the Mountain Ute Indian tribe down in southwest Colorado. So it's a tribal enterprise, and we support that. But the rest of that mash bill is about 20% purple barley, which is very unique. Nobody's heard of purple barley, and rye. So we've changed that recipe a little bit, or that mash bill from what was there. And then I think we've experimented with not a whole lot, but a number of different barrels. Because for whiskey, barrels are 60 to 70% of the flavor in a whiskey.
Yes.
And so the type of barrel, the quality of the barrel, the aging of the barrel, how long you leave it in the barrel, have a huge impact on the taste and the quality of the whiskey that you're going to have.
Absolutely, and that was something I kind of wanted to get at here. The aging process for bourbon is, as you said, between 2 and 20 years.
Yeah, I said that a little facetiously, but
but it's not wrong.
But it's not wrong. So really, you want it to be at least 2 years, and that makes it qualify as straight bourbon, which is a category within bourbon. Most bourbons are 2 to 4 years that you're going to go in the liquor store and buy, and then there's the Pappy Van Winkle, which is the current cult bourbon, Pappy Van Winkle 23, so 23-year-old.
Right.
It takes a while, or it can take a long time
Yeah.
to age and put barrels back, but those are all pretty special barrels.
Yes.
So even the Pappy is a pretty special barrel.
Absolutely, and it's fantastic, if
Yes,
I
it
may
is.
say so. But that being said, so this aging process. So walk me through this. You've got this barrel, and this is your 20-year barrel. I imagine that you've already started right on a 20-year barrel.
Maybe, yeah,
Maybe.
it's possible. We put,
Not,
we have barrels in inventory. It just depends on when we empty them. So.
yes. But that being said, like, what if it's terrible?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Is there a plan in place for if it just turns out crappy?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's why when we barrel, we put it in the barrel warehouse, but we sample it throughout its life.
Okay.
And so we haven't had any that we would put in as terrible, but we have had some we've liked better than others, and that's been a combination of, we've put different mash bills in the same barrel so we can control whether it's the grain or the barrel. And then we've tried different barrels with the same mash bill so we can tell whether it's the barrel that's influencing them. So far we don't have any barrels that I think are going to just be bad after 20 years.
Right.
There are secrets of the trade, so you could take those barrels and blend them, and a lot of times blending makes a difference to the end result.
Yes.
But so far we kind of like everything we have. The hard part's been trying to choose which direction or which of those that we want to do. Except that we've kind of honed in that we like these barrels pretty well. So we'll probably keep these barrels, maybe tweak the mash bill, and I think we're off to a good start for that. So we don't have any barrels that have turned out. Pretty fast if there's off flavors or it's not going to be good. Pretty quickly.
Good.
Age almost always makes it better. It almost can't make it worse.
Yeah.
If you had a bad barrel or you over barreled it, it could get bad, I guess. But in most cases, it's going to get better with age.
Like
As long as you start, yeah, exactly. As long as you start with good barrels, good quality grain, aging's going to make it better, not worse.
Yes.
But you still don't know exactly how it's going to come out because temperature changes. The humidity levels, the barrel itself, how long the barrel wood was seasoned before you put the whiskey in it,
Yeah.
all influence that results. That's why you have so many different whiskeys that are so similar but different. They all have a little different, flavors and qualities, that kind of thing.
Yes, getting a nose for that is also tough, but it goes along with your distillery destination idea, right?
Right.
You're going to teach that, and I that is a fascinating idea. I'm very excited to see where that goes. I also wanted to ask here, the barrel buying process, as you mentioned, distilleries aren't as saturated as wineries or breweries at the moment because it's a bigger buy-in. It's a bigger process. So I imagine that these barrel rooms, first of all, must be temperature and humidity controlled. So you're already looking at more money going into that. But the barrel buying process itself is an adventure on its own, right?
A little bit because, again, different barrels. So bourbon has to be new American oak. But oak from Missouri will taste different than oak from Minnesota or oak from Kentucky or other oak forests.
Yeah.
The barrels that we really like, we found them, kind of stumbled across it at a trade show. I bought a barrel and tried it. Interestingly, it was an American oak, but the oak had been shipped to France, and the barrel was actually coopered in France and then shipped back, none of which makes it cheaper, for the record. And it had a unique shape, and it was a smaller barrel, and you can get the flavor faster in a smaller barrel.
Yes.
Because there's more surface area to volume. But we love the barrel, and so we're now getting those barrels in 53-gallon barrels from the same forest, the same supplier. They're not getting shipped to France, but they're being coopered in Napa. Okay. And it'll be the same oak, same flavor, just different size and shape barrel than the one we have. But that's how we found it.
Yeah.
After we tried multiple other vendors, and they were good. So I don't want to say anything bad about those barrels, but we just like these better.
You just, you have a preference.
But one thing you mentioned about humidity and temperature, you have to keep it controlled. Not necessarily.
Okay. See?
Humidity probably. So in Scotland or whiskey, you put it in barrels, and you actually the alcohol in the water evaporates. So in Scotland, they call it the angel's share. And in Scotland, where it's pretty cold and humid and pretty constant temperature, they lose 2 to 3% per year of evaporation. In Colorado, because it's so dry, if we didn't humidify our barrel room, we would lose 15 to 20% per year.
Yeah.
Per year. So think if you wouldn't have a 20-year-old bourbon because you wouldn't have nothing left.
Evaporate.
It'd be gone, right? And when the barrel starts losing volume, it starts drying up faster and a lot of problems. So we are humidifying our barrel room.
Okay.
Temperature is a different thing. We actually like temperature changes because it creates action between the wood and the whiskey. So the whiskey goes into the pores of the wood and then are kind of released at different temperature levels.
Fantastic.
So we don't necessarily try to keep our barrel room exactly the same temperature all the time, but we are trying to keep it humidified.
Awesome. Well, and I imagine with any, as the seasons change, right, you're going to get a natural change in temperature.
Right. So quick, in Kentucky, since you mentioned that, just by comparison, they have these giant barrel warehouses, like 5 stories tall, 1 million barrels in the warehouse.
Yeah.
And the whiskey at the top of the warehouse ages very differently than whiskey at the bottom because of the temperature difference.
Yeah.
And so some distillers will rotate those barrels so they'll all end up having had their time at the different levels of the warehouse. Other distillers will say, no, we like those differences, and they capitalize on those differences, and they'll blend from the different sections to get to the flavor profile they want, or they'll just release a single barrel bourbon that only came from the top of the warehouse or only came from the bottom of the warehouse, and that's how you get different flavors or different flavor profiles.
Oh man, I'm learning so much.
Yeah,
this is fascinating.
And that's what we want to do. Even today, we come get a tour. We try to educate and explain and answer people's questions, because everybody knows a little bit about what they like, but most people don't know the nerdy stuff, I guess. But it makes it interesting, but it also helps you understand why you like what you like.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and it would be interesting to know, exactly what my favorite bourbon went through.
Right. What is your favorite bourbon?
I actually am a Woodford Reserve gal.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
But it'll soon be Whistling Hare, right?
Of course it will.
Okay.
Of course it will. The boss frowns a little bit on drinking on the job, but maybe we'll do that here.
Okay.
So I also, I have tons of questions, but let's talk about actually the Whistling Hare, your tasting room, what people can come do, and have you ever thought about letting anyone distill their own?
Yes.
Yes.
We have. We're not really set up for that at the moment. There's a few places around that do that. The hard part is it's a multi-day week process. So you've got to cook your grains. You've got to ferment them. The cooking takes a day. Fermentation takes 5 days. Then you got to distill it a couple of times, and then you got to put it in barrels. So if you were making bourbon, you could pretty easily experience any one part of that, but you'd have to come back for every day for a couple of weeks to kind of do all of it.
Okay.
Gin's where I really want to do it, because gin has so many variables because of the botanicals that are in it, and I'd like to have people come have the different botanicals distilled and let them blend their own gin to create the flavor profile that they like, because it's very, again, kind of like bourbon, maybe even more so. Everybody kind of likes different flavor profiles.
Yes.
Some like a little more floral, some like a little more earthy, some like a little more citrus, some like heavy juniper, light juniper. And so we'd let them experiment and have that experience.
Yes, there's a city in Oregon that I used to fly to quite a bit, And every time I would get off the airplane, it smelled like juniper. And I was
Right.
like, ah, gin.
Right. Right.
Yes, let's do talk. So you are located in Westminster.
Westminster. Yep.
Open Thursday through Sunday.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we have a tasting room. A lot of people just drop by and have cocktails and sit in the tasting room and have drinks after work. We do tours. You usually ask people to come, call ahead and schedule this. We're a small shop. We just want to make sure there's somebody there to give you a tour, and because we're not just there 24/7 or even during the opening hours. We may not be distilling or have somebody available, but call ahead. We'll schedule a tour. You can always come and for sure taste everything that we make, and if I'm there or my distillery manager's there, we'd be glad to show you around and give you a tour and taste.
Fantastic. Golly. So again, Westminster, the Whistling Hare, go try. They've got a tasting room. You can set up for a tour. Just make sure you call ahead. We'll have that information in the description below here. Before you go, Sandy, I have just one more question for you. Overall, business-wise, you had some great experience, right, with your career. But if there's somebody looking into getting into distilling or owning their own distillery, what should they be looking out for?
Yeah. Well, great question. Depends on what their vision is, what they want to accomplish. I would just tell them it's going to take you longer than you thought, cost you more than you thought, and it's hard. Sales are tough because it's crowded. The shelf space is hard to come by, and you really have to go build your own brand and your own following. Distributors are great. I'll have a distributor, I hope, at some point, but they have hundreds of choices.
Yeah.
You've got to make yours attractive so that they'll not just distribute but help you support it. But you really have to make that effort yourself.
Yes.
But just the regulatory process for distilling, the rules are a little arcane. They're all basically post-prohibition rules that never contemplated a craft distiller.
Yeah.
So you really have to get in, learn the regulatory framework. They frown very poorly or do not like non-compliance. So you got to do it right. You got to do it by the books. The rules for what you call it, how you do it, they're not hard, but they're specific.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of variance there. The good part about the United States is in the U.S. you can make almost anything you want, but the rules are strict on what you call it. So you can't just say, I'm going to make bourbon this way if it doesn't meet the rules. But what you made may be great. It may be a whiskey. It's just not going to be bourbon.
Okay.
So you have to label it and kind of know what your label requirements are. Every label has to be approved by the federal government, so that takes a little extra time and effort. And that's when they check the rules and make sure that you are complying. But it's fun. I mean, I would encourage anybody to do it. I think the more the merrier. I'm not afraid of the competition. I'd love 3 more distillers right next door to me.
I love that.
Well, kind of like Napa, and my view is if I can't compete and win, then it's my fault, not their fault. So.
Fantastic outlook for so many things, really, in life, not just business.
Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah.
Well, Sandy, thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure. I am looking forward to having some of that bourbon with you.
All right, good.
Yeah. Again, this is the Whistling Hare Distillery. It is in Westminster. Again, they have the tasting room. They're open Thursday through Sunday. If you want a tour, call ahead for that. One more time, we have more information in the description below, so be sure to click on that link. Also, like and subscribe to our YouTube page while you're here, and you can find this podcast and more at cobrt.com/radio-podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. It was fun. Come see us.
Yes.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers.
Yeah.